This is a fan-generated show. If you would like to support us, please go to jamieglazov.com, and also don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. All your support is greatly appreciated.
Okay, Daniel, let's begin. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, some readers know I was actually born in Israel. I was born in Jerusalem. But my father was in World War II. My grandfather was in World War I. And, you know, the usual thing that I say, if there's ever a World War III, there is a good chance I will be in it. My father was actually a little boy when the Nazis invaded Poland. Well, not that little at this point. He was already 11, 12, but he ended up having to flee. He found himself joining the partisans. My mother, quite a bit later, was a dissident in the Soviet Union, was a political dissident. She came to fight for Jewish rights, and she eventually managed to make it to Israel, where she met my father, who had also made it to Israel.
Fascinating story. Now, and why will you be in World War III?
Well, because my grandfather was in World War I, my father was in World War II, so there's a bit of a pattern there.
Oh, okay. All right. Daniel, what is your faith?
Well, I'm Jewish.
Okay, and are you liberal? Are you conservative? How do you define yourself, and how do you practice your Jewish faith?
Well, I'm conservative politically, religiously. I'm part of what is known as Orthodox Judaism, which basically believes that the Bible, the Torah, comes directly from God, and that we are meant to actually follow the ways of God, while various more overall denominations have their own takes, but are less likely to believe in a divinely inspired truth. Okay,
and just, just tell us one or two things in terms of, for instance, what happens on Friday evening until Saturday evening in general for our viewers.
Well, on Friday evening begins the Sabbath, which is the commemoration of the time when God created the earth and then rested on the Sabbath. So to commemorate that, we also rest. We don't do any work. That's the period of time where, of course, as Jamie, you know, I'm very much offline and just incommunicado for that period of time. And it's a way to commemorate obviously the creation of the world, God's role in the world and in our lives on a constant basis, because when we interrupt the week, when we interrupt the time that we have to work, that we have to go through our usual routine, we're reminded that ultimately everything that is possible, everything in the world comes from God.
Right, and it's a time also of showing respect to God in many things. And just may I ask, because I know several friends of mine, so can you just give us an example? There's certain forms, like you don't send email and there's no use of electricity, etc. Could you just talk about that?
Sure. Well, just as a practical thing, we don't do work, which means we're not going to use electricity. It means I'm not online. It means I'm not on the phone. It means I'm not on the computer. It means that I may hear the news. For example, during the terrorist attack in Orlando, I heard the news, but I couldn't actually do anything about it. And there is a kind of comfort in that, because, again, it reminds you ultimately that God runs the world. There are things we can do, but there's also a time to just let go and let God control things.
Daniel, how is that biblically based? It's connected to fire, I think, as well in the Old Testament, right?
That's quite correct. There are certain types of categories of labor, and this kind of thing gets complicated, but suffice it to say, electricity is also considered fire. You're sparking something. You're creating energy, or at least you're not creating energy, but you're bringing energy to life. You're making use of it.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Daniel. Like, we definitely need probably 2 hours on each of these questions I'm going to ask, but just very quickly, and I apologize for approaching very profound, serious subjects, and only we have 30 seconds perhaps to discuss each one. But do you also believe in the existence of the soul and in the afterlife?
Absolutely. We come into this world. God breathed in the first soul into Adam, the first man, and he breathes it into each and every one of us. There's a part of us that comes from God and that returns to God when our time in this world is done.
And do you believe in heaven and hell?
Well, we believe in a kind of heaven and hell. This is an area that's a bit above my pay grade. We're not within Judaism. We don't really think that much about the afterlife. We're told that our mission is to labor in this world for God, and that we're not meant to think of the reward necessarily, but to be faithful servants to God. Nonetheless, there is a kind of a heaven and a hell, and in a very general sense, because these are complicated concepts, we think of heaven as being closeness to God and hell as being distance from God.
Okay. Daniel, in terms of the stories of Adam and Eve, of the ark, etc., are those metaphorical to you, or do you believe those literally?
Well, as Orthodox Jews, we believe in the literal truth of the Bible, which means that we actually believe that all of this happened. It's not just a metaphor. There are aspects of it that are also metaphors that illustrate all sorts of ideas, but we also believe that these are literal truths.
Right. Daniel, let me ask you this. In terms of your identity, in terms of the faith that we've just very quickly touched on some elements, why are they so opposed to the leftist vision of the world? And why does the leftist viewpoint so much hate, really, the Judeo-Christian tradition and also Jewish people in Israel, etc.?
At the most basic level, the left is a secular religion. It worships God, it worships man rather than God. It's powered by the idea that we can actually take government, replace God with government, and then build an entire cult of personality, an entire religion around people, monsters really like Stalin or Hitler or Castro or Che, all the other ones, or Mao. And with that cult of personality, we can justify human sacrifices, the sacrifice of millions of people, to show the power of government. It's anti-God at the most fundamental level, and it invariably comes after the Jews. Because if you're building an ideology that is hostile to God, that is opposed to the very idea of God, of spirituality in the world, then you have to crush the very people who, introduced it to the world. If you believe that there is nothing in this world but material reality, that there's nothing meaningful but force and power, then the best way to demonstrate that is to, again, destroy the Jews.
Right, and some scholars have written on this. I remember I was fascinated as a kid reading this, that Jews are also hated very much by many in the world, but the left especially, because they created conscience.
Yes, that's the fundamental reality of it. Because conscience comes from the recognition that there is a higher moral authority, that there is something outside ourselves. And if there's nothing outside ourselves, then conscience is meaningless. It's just how you are accountable to yourself. It's something like honor. But when you actually recognize that there is a God, then there is something higher than you for you to be accountable to. There is somebody who knows what you did and whom you can't lie to or deceive, and that is a very powerful idea.
And when you are a self-appointed social redeemer and you make yourself a God, then you hate the idea of God and of God's hierarchy.
Yes, there's no room for it at all, because the left creates salvation and damnation from within man. So man is destroying the world through global warming, through whatever they're calling it now, climate change. And then man can save the world by recycling. There's the whole drama of salvation and damnation, of redemption. You can transform the world, you can change the world. There is sin. Sin is going against anything that the left believes, against any of its social policies. And of course, there are the good deeds. There's redemption through social justice. And all this is meant to displace the actual religion and then the idea of God. So you have to destroy those things in order to make the ideology of the left completely triumphant in the world. And that's why every leftist regime is invariably militantly socialist, it's anti-religious, it persecutes religious people.
Daniel, how can a person that considers themselves a Jew possibly be a leftist? But there are so many leftist Jews.
Well, they can't. So when we talk about Jews, we're talking about two things. We're talking about a race, an ethnic group, and we're also talking about a religion. Now, there are, of course, plenty of people with Jewish last names, people who are ethnically, originally were Jewish, but that's largely meaningless. Jewish is an identity, and it's also a religious practice. It's something that you bring down from your parents and something you pass down to your children. If you're not part of this continuous chain, then you're not part of the Jewish people. You're just a person with a Jewish last name. Now, the process of leftist secularization has created a very weird reality where, for example, a majority of American Jews rate having a sense of humor as being more important to being Jewish than actually believing in religion or attending synagogue on any kind of regular basis. And, well, having a sense of humor is very nice. I like to think I have a bit of a sense of humor. But if you think that your identity and the identity of the Jewish people is defined by having a sense of humor, then you're kind of out to lunch.
And it could be legitimately said that leftist Jews ultimately are Jews that are trying to shed themselves of their own Judaism.
That's very much so. So there's a kind of historical basis for this. Once the left took over, it provided opportunities to assimilate, to integrate into society in exchange for abandoning religion. In France, for example, this was a very explicit bargain. In the Soviet Union, it was far more explicit. Basically, for example, my grandfather was never able to get a higher education because his father had actually been what was considered a religious worker, which meant that in the Soviet term, he was one of the followers of a cult, which meant that he could never really have proper civil rights. So the Soviet Union did everything it could to stamp out Judaism, to stamp out the practice of religion, because the goal was to wipe it out. Now, the people that the Soviet Union was using to do this dirty work, at least initially, were known as the Yevsektia, or the Jewish section. So they would take these leftist Jews, and these people would very willingly, enthusiastically, they would shut down synagogues, they would inform on people, they would attack worshipers during services, they would attack rabbis, they would denounce people and make sure that they were sent to the gulag, that they were executed, because there was this kind of civil war between those Jews who actually believed in the religion and those who believed in the left, and the civil war is still going on today.
Right, because when the left creates its utopian paradise where everybody holds hands and is equal, the Jew that somewhere hates himself or is trying to shed himself of his Judaism, or maybe is so frightened by anti-Semitism, he doesn't have to be a Jew anymore, right? In that utopian paradise, right?
That's exactly so. And this is something that Lenin wrote about. It's something that H.G. Wells and others wrote about. Their sales pitch was that there are actually no Jews. They're just these people who were kind of singled out. They're a bit confused. They're going to integrate with the rest of society, and then Jewishness will vanish. And those who refuse to are reactionaries, and they're going to have to be cracked down on. And this was their general approach to religion.